In the first place, such information should have come from Eisenhower, not Montgomery. But worse, the Supreme Commander seemed to London to be taking too much into his own hands. In the British view, he had not only stepped far beyond his authority by dealing directly with Stalin, but he had also changed long-standing plans without warning. Instead of attacking across Germany's northern plains with Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which had been specially built up for the offensive, Eisenhower had suddenly tapped Bradley to make the last drive of the war through the heart of the Reich. Brooke bitterly summed up the British attitude. To start with, Eisenhower has no business to address Stalin direct. His communications should be through the combined chiefs of staff. Secondly, he produced a telegram which was unintelligible. And finally, what was implied in it appeared to be a drift and a change from all that had been agreed on. On the afternoon of March 29, an irate Brooke, without consulting Churchill, fired off a sharp protest to Washington. A bitter and vitriolic debate was slowly building up about SCAF 252. At about the same time, General Dean in Moscow, having taken the first steps to arrange a meeting with Stalin, sent an urgent cable to Eisenhower. Dean wanted some additional background information in case Stalin wishes to discuss your plans in more detail. After months of frustrating dealings with the Russians, Dean knew full well what the Generalissimo would ask for, and he spelled it all out for Eisenhower. 1. The present composition of armies. 2. A little more detail on the scheme of maneuver. 3. Which army or armies you envisage making the main and secondary advances. 4. Brief current estimate of enemy dispositions and intentions. Scaife quickly complied. At 8:15 that night, the intelligence was on its way to Moscow. Dean got the composition of the Anglo-American armies and their order of battle from north to south. So detailed was the information that it even included the fact that the US Ninth Army was to revert back from Montgomery to Bradley. 51 minutes later, Scaife heard from Montgomery. He was understandably distressed. With the loss of Simpson's army, the strength of his drive was sapped, and his chance of triumphantly capturing Berlin seemed gone. But he still hoped to persuade Eisenhower to delay the transfer. He sent an unusually tactful message. "I note," he said, "that you intend to change the command set up. If you feel this is necessary, I pray you not to do so until we reach the Elbe, as such action would not help the great movement which is now beginning to develop." Montgomery's British superiors were in no mood to be tactful, as Washington officials quickly discovered. At the Pentagon, Brooke's protest was formally delivered to General Marshall by the British representative to the combined Chiefs of Staff, Field Marshal Sir Henry Maitland Wilson. The British note condemned the procedure Eisenhower had adopted in communicating with Stalin and charged that the Supreme Commander had changed plans. Marshall, both surprised and concerned, promptly radioed Eisenhower. His message was mainly a straightforward report on the British protest. It argued, he said, that existing strategy should be followed, that Montgomery's northern drive would secure the German ports and thereby, to a great extent, annul the U-boat war, and that it would also free Holland, Denmark, and open up communications with Sweden again, making available nearly 2 million tons of Swedish and Norwegian shipping now lying idle in Swedish ports. The British chiefs, Marshall quoted, feel strongly that the main thrust, across the open plains of NW Germany with the object of capturing Berlin, should be adhered to. To fend off Eisenhower's British critics and to patch up Anglo-American unity as quickly as possible, Marshall was prepared to give latitude and understanding to both sides. Yet his own puzzlement and annoyance with the Supreme Commander's actions showed through the last paragraph of his message. Prior to your dispatch of SCAF, 252 had the naval aspects of the British been considered. He ended with, "Your comments are requested as a matter of urgency." One man above all others felt urgency, and indeed impending chaos in the situation. Winston Churchill's anxiety had been mounting almost hourly. The Eisenhower incident had arisen at a moment when relations among the three allies were not going well. It was a critical period, and Churchill felt very much alone. He did not know how ill Roosevelt was, but for some time previous he had been puzzled and uneasy about his correspondence with the President. As he was later to put it, "In my long telegrams I thought I was talking to my trusted friend and colleague, but I was no longer being fully heard by him. Various hands drafted in combination the answers which were sent in his name. Roosevelt could only give general guidance and approval. These were costly weeks for all." Even more worrisome was the rapid political deterioration that was evident between the West and Russia. Churchill's suspicions about Stalin's post-war aims had grown steadily since Yalta. The Soviet premier had contemptuously disregarded the promises made there. Nearly every day now, new and ominous trends appeared. Eastern Europe was slowly being swallowed up by the USSR. Anglo-American bombers, downed behind Red Army lines because of fuel or mechanical problems, were being interned along with their crews. Air bases and facilities promised by Stalin for the use of American bombers had been suddenly denied. The Russians, granted free access to liberated prisoner of war camps in Western Germany for the repatriation of their troops, refused similar permission to Western representatives to enter, evacuate, or in any way aid Anglo-American soldiers in Eastern European camps. Worse, Stalin had charged that Soviet ex-prisoners of war in US camps were subjected to unfair treatment and unlawful persecution, including beating. When the Germans in Italy tried to negotiate secretly the surrender of their forces, Russian reaction was to fire off an insulting note accusing the Allies of treacherously dealing with the enemy behind the back of the Soviet Union, which is bearing the brunt of the war. And now had come the Eisenhower message to Stalin. At a time when the choice of military objectives might well determine the future of post-war Europe, Churchill considered that Eisenhower's communication with the Soviet dictator constituted a dangerous intervention into global and political strategy, realms that were strictly the concern of Roosevelt and the Prime Minister. To Churchill, Berlin was of crucial political importance, and it now looked as though Eisenhower did not intend to make an all-out effort to capture the city. Before midnight on March 29, Churchill had called Eisenhower on the scrambler telephone and asked for a clarification of the Supreme Commander's plans. The Prime Minister carefully avoided mentioning the Stalin cable. Instead, he stressed the political significance of Berlin and argued that Montgomery should be allowed to continue the northern offensive. It was of paramount importance, Churchill felt, that the Allies capture the capital before the Russians. Now, on this March 30, as he began the 60-odd-mile drive to Chequers, he pondered Eisenhower's answer with profound concern. Berlin, the Supreme Commander had said, is no longer a major military objective. In Reims, Dwight Eisenhower's temper was mounting in pace with the British protests. The London reaction to the curbing of Montgomery's northern drive had surprised him by its vehemence, but more astonishing to Eisenhower was the storm raging over his cable to Stalin. He could see no reason for any controversy. He believed his action was both correct and militarily essential, and he was incensed to find his decision challenged. Short-tempered at best, Eisenhower was now the angriest Allied leader of all. On the morning of March 30, he began to respond to the messages from Washington and London. His first move was to send a brief acknowledgement of Marshall's overnight cable. He promised a more detailed answer within a few hours, but for the moment simply stated that he had not changed plans and that the British charge has no possible basis in fact. My plan will get the ports and all the other things on the north coast more speedily and decisively than will the dispersion now urged upon me by Wilson's message to you. Next, in reply to the Prime Minister's nighttime telephone request, he sent Churchill additional details clarifying the orders which had been issued Montgomery. Subject to Russian intentions, a central drive to Leipzig and Dresden under Bradley's command seemed called for because it would cut the German armies approximately in half and destroy the major part of the remaining enemy forces in the west. Once its success was assured, Eisenhower intended to take action to clear the northern ports. Montgomery, said the Supreme Commander, would be responsible for these tasks, and I propose to increase his forces if that should seem necessary. Once the above requirements have been met, Eisenhower planned to send General Beevor and his 6th Army Group southeast toward the redoubt area to prevent any possible German consolidation in the south and to join hands with the Russians in the Danube Valley. The Supreme Commander closed by remarking that his present plans were flexible and subject to changes to meet unexpected situations. Berlin was not mentioned. Eisenhower's message to the Prime Minister was restrained and correct. It did not reflect his anger. But his fury was clearly evident in the detailed cable he sent, as promised earlier, to Marshall. Eisenhower told the U.S. Chief of Staff that he was completely in the dark as to what the protest concerning procedure involved. I have been instructed to deal directly with the Russians concerning military coordination. As for his strategy, Eisenhower insisted again that there was no change. The British Chiefs of Staff last summer, he said, always protested against my determination to open up the central route because they said it would be futile and draw strength away from a northern attack. I have always insisted that the northern attack would be the principal effort in the isolation of the Ruhr, but from the very beginning, extending back before D-Day, my plan has been to link up primary and secondary efforts and then make one great thrust to the eastward. Even cursory examination shows that the principal effort should be toward the Leipzig region, in which area is concentrated the greater part of the remaining German industrial capacity and to which area German ministries are believed to be moving. Harking back to the old Montgomery Brook agitation for a single thrust strategy, Eisenhower said, "Merely following the principle that Field Marshal Brooke has always shouted to me, I am determined to concentrate on one major thrust, and all that my plan does is to place the 9th U.S. Army back under Bradley for that phase of operations involving the advance of the center. The plan clearly shows that 9th Army may again have to move up to assist the British and Canadian armies in clearing the whole coastline to the westward of Lübeck. Afterward, we can launch a movement to the southeastward to prevent Nazi occupation of the mountain citadel." The National Redoubt, which Eisenhower called the Mountain Citadel, was now clearly a major military goal, of more concern, in fact, than Berlin. "May I point out," the Supreme Commander said, "that Berlin itself is no longer a particularly important objective. Its usefulness to the German has been largely destroyed, and even his government is preparing to move to another area. What is now important is to gather up our forces for a single drive, and this will more quickly bring about the fall of Berlin, the relief of Norway, and the acquisition of the shipping and the Swedish ports than will the scattering around of our effort." By the time Eisenhower reached the final paragraph of his message, his anger at the British was barely contained. "The Prime Minister and his Chiefs of Staff," he declared, "opposed Anvil the invasion of southern France. They opposed my idea that the Germans should be destroyed west of the Rhine before we made our great effort across the river, and they insisted that the route leading northeastward from Frankfurt would involve us merely in slow, rough country fighting. Now they apparently want me to turn aside on operations in which would be involved many thousands of troops before the German forces are fully defeated. I submit that these things are studied daily and hourly by me and my advisers, and that we are animated by one single thought, which is the early winning of this war." In Washington, later that day, General Marshall and the combined Chiefs of Staff received an amplification of the British Chiefs of Staff protest of the day before. For the most part, the second telegram was a lengthy reiteration of the first, but there were two important additions. In the interim, the British had learned from Admiral Archer in Moscow of the supplementary intelligence forwarded from Schaeff to Dean. The British strongly urged that this information be withheld from the Russians. In the event that discussions had already begun, London wanted the talks suspended until the combined Chiefs of Staff had reviewed the situation. But by now the British were beginning to disagree among themselves, not just over the propriety of the Eisenhower message, but over which parts of it should be attacked. The British Chiefs of Staff had neglected to show Churchill their protests before sending them off to Washington. and Churchill's objections differed from those of his military advisers. To him, the main criticism of the new Eisenhower plan is that it shifts the axis of the main advance upon Berlin to the direction through Leipzig and Dresden. As the Prime Minister saw it, under this plan British forces might be condemned to an almost static role in the north. Worse, all prospect also of the British entering Berlin with the Americans is ruled out. Berlin, as always now, was uppermost in the Prime Minister's thoughts. It seemed to him that Eisenhower may be wrong in supposing Berlin to be largely devoid of military or political importance. Although government departments had to a great extent overed to the south, the dominating fact on German minds of the fall of Berlin should not be overlooked. He was haunted by the danger involved in neglecting Berlin and leaving it to the Russians. He declared, "As long as Berlin holds out and withstands a siege in the ruins, as it may easily do, German resistance will be stimulated. The fall of Berlin might cause nearly all Germans to despair." While agreeing in principle with the arguments of his chiefs of staff, Churchill felt they had brought into their objections many minor extraneous matters. He pointed out that Eisenhower's credit with the US chiefs of staff stands very high. The Americans will feel that, as the victorious Supreme Commander, he had a right, and indeed a vital need, to try to elicit from the Russians the best point for making contact by the armies of the West and of the East. The British protest, Churchill feared, would only provide argumentative possibilities to the US chiefs of staff. He expected them to riposte heavily, and they did. On Saturday, March 31, the American military chiefs gave Eisenhower their unqualified support. They agreed with the British on only 2 points: that Eisenhower should amplify his plans for the combined chiefs of staff, and that additional details to Dean should be held up. In the view of the US chiefs, the Battle of Germany is now at the point where the commander in the field is the best judge of the measures which offer the earliest prospect of destroying the German armies or their power to resist. General Eisenhower should continue to be free to communicate with the commander-in-chief of the Soviet army. To the American military leaders there was only one aim, and it did not include political considerations. The single objective, they said, should be quick and complete victory. Still, the controversy was far from over. In Reims, a harassed Eisenhower was still explaining and re-explaining his position. During the day, following Marshall's instructions, Eisenhower sent the combined chiefs of staff a long and detailed exposition of his plans. Next, he cabled Moscow and ordered Dean to withhold from Stalin the additional information sent from Schaeff. After that, he assured Marshall in still another message, "You may be sure that in future, policy cables passing between myself and the military mission in Moscow will be repeated to the combined chiefs of staff and the British." And finally, he came to Montgomery's still unanswered plea, which had arrived nearly 48 hours before. It was more than the urgency of his previous cables that caused Eisenhower to answer Montgomery last. Relations between the two men had become so strained that Eisenhower was now communicating with the Field Marshal only when absolutely necessary. As the Supreme Commander explained years later, Montgomery had become so personal in his efforts to make sure that the Americans, and me in particular, got no credit, that in fact we hardly had anything to do with the war, that I finally stopped talking to him. The Supreme Commander and his staff, including, interestingly, the senior British generals at Schaeff, saw Montgomery as an egocentric troublemaker who in the field was overcautious and slow. Monty wanted to ride into Berlin on a white charger wearing 2 hats, recalled British Major General John Whiteley, Schaiff's deputy operations chief, but the feeling was that if anything was to be done quickly, don't give it to Monty. Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, Schaiff's deputy chief of staff, put it another way. At that moment, Monty was the last person Ike would have chosen for a drive on Berlin. Monty would have needed at least 6 months to prepare. Bradley was a different sort. Bradley, Eisenhower told his aide, has never held up, never paused to regroup when he saw an opportunity to advance. Now, Eisenhower's anger over the criticism of his cable to Stalin, coupled with his long-standing antagonism toward Montgomery, was clearly reflected in his reply to the field marshal. It exuded annoyance. "I must adhere," it said, "to my decision about Ninth Army passing to Bradley's command. As I have already told you, it appears from this distance that an American formation will again pass to you at a later stage for operations beyond the Elbe. You will note that in none of this do I mention Berlin. That place has become, as far as I am concerned, nothing but a geographical location, and I have never been interested in these. My purpose is to destroy the enemy's forces." Even as Eisenhower was making his position evident to Montgomery, Churchill at Chequers was writing the Supreme Commander a historic plea. It was in nearly every respect the antithesis of Eisenhower's words to Montgomery. A little before 7 p.m., the Prime Minister wired the Supreme Commander, "If the enemy's position should weaken, as you evidently expect, why should we not cross the Elbe and advance as far eastward as possible? This has an important political bearing, as the Russian army seems certain to enter Vienna and overrun Austria. If we deliberately leave Berlin to them, even if it should be in our grasp, the double event may strengthen their conviction, already apparent, that they have done everything. Further, I do not consider myself that Berlin has lost its military, and certainly not its political significance. The fall of Berlin would have a profound psychological effect on German resistance in every part of the Reich. While Berlin holds out, great masses of Germans will feel it their duty to go down fighting. The idea that the capture of Dresden and the juncture with the Russians there would be a superior gain does not commend itself to me. Whilst Berlin remains under the German flag, it cannot, in my opinion, fail to be the most decisive point in Germany. Therefore, I should greatly prefer persistence in the plan on which we crossed the Rhine, namely that the 9th U.S. Army should march with the 21st Army Group to the Elbe and beyond to Berlin." In Moscow, as darkness fell, the American and British ambassadors, together with Dean and Archer, met with the Soviet Premier and delivered Eisenhower's message. The conference was brief. Stalin, as Dean later reported to the Supreme Commander, was impressed with the direction of the attack in central Germany, and he thought Eisenhower's main effort was a good one in that it accomplished the most important objective of dividing Germany in half. He felt too that the Germans' last stand would probably be in western Czechoslovakia and Bavaria. While approving of Anglo-American strategy, Stalin was non-committal about his own. The final coordination of Soviet plans, the Premier said, would have to wait until he had a chance to consult with his staff. At the conclusion of the meeting, he promised to reply to Eisenhower's message within 24 hours. Moments after his visitors left, Stalin picked up the phone and called Marshals Zhukov and Konev. He spoke tersely, but his orders were clear. The two commanders were to fly to Moscow immediately for an urgent conference the following day, Easter Sunday. Although he did not explain the reason for his orders, Stalin had decided that the Western Allies were lying. He was quite sure Eisenhower planned to race the Red Army for Berlin. The 1,000-mile flight to Moscow from the Eastern Front had been long and tiring. Marshal Georgy Zhukov sat wearily back in his field-grey staff car as it joggled up the cobblestone hill and into the vastness of Red Square. The car sped past the Cathedral of St. Basil the Blessed with its multi-hued candy-striped cupolas, swung left and entered the Kremlin's fortress walls through the western gate. Immediately behind Zhukov, in another army sedan, was Marshal Ivan Konev. On the clock face of the Great Saviour's Tower guarding the entrance, the gilt hands showed almost 5 p.m. Crossing the wind-swept interior courtyards, the two staff cars advanced into the architectural thicket of frescoed palaces, golden-domed cathedrals, and massive yellow-fronted government buildings, once the domain of Russian czars and princes, and headed for the center of the Kremlin compound. Near the monumental 17th-century white brick bell tower of Ivan the Great, the cars slowed, rolled past a line of ancient cannon, and came to a stop outside a long 3-story sand-colored building. Moments later, the two men, in well-cut, dun-colored uniforms with heavy gold epaulets bearing the 1-inch wide single star of a Soviet field marshal, were in the elevator headed for Stalin's second-floor offices. In those brief moments, surrounded by aides and escorting officers, the two men chatted affably together. A casual observer might have thought them close friends. In truth, they were bitter rivals. Both Zhukov and Koniev had reached the peak of their profession. Each was a tough, pragmatic perfectionist, and throughout the officer corps it was considered both an honor and an awesome responsibility to serve under them. The short, stocky, mild-looking Zhukov was the better known, idolized by the public and Russian enlisted men as the Soviet Union's greatest soldier. Yet there were those among the commissioned ranks who saw him as a monster. Zhukov was a professional who had begun his career as a private in the Tsar's Imperial Dragoons. When the Russian Revolution began in 1917, he had joined the revolutionaries. As a Soviet cavalryman, he had fought the anti-Bolsheviks with such courage and ferocity that in the post-Civil War, Red Army he was rewarded with a commission. Although he was gifted with a brilliant imagination and a natural flair for command, he might have remained a relatively unknown officer but for Stalin's brutal purging of the Red Army's generals in the 30s. Most of those purged were veterans of the revolution, but Zhukov, possibly because he was more army than party, escaped. The ruthless removal of the old guard speeded up his promotion. By 1941 he had risen to the highest military job in the USSR, Chief of the Soviet General Staff. Zhukov was known as the soldier's soldier. Perhaps because he had once been a private himself, he had a reputation for leniency with enlisted men. So long as his troops fought well, he considered the spoils of war no more than their just deserts. But with his officers, he was a harsh disciplinarian. Senior commanders who failed to measure up were often fired on the spot and then punished for failing. The punishment usually took one of two forms. The officer either was sent to join a penal battalion or was ordered to serve on the most exposed part of the front line, as a private. Sometimes he was given a choice. Once during the Polish campaign of 1944, Zhukov had stood with Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky and General Pavel Batov, commander of the 65th Army, watching the troops advance. Suddenly Zhukov, viewing the scene through binoculars, yelled at Batov, "The corps commander and the commander of the 44th Rifle Division, Penal Battalion." Both Rokossovsky and Batov began to plead for the two generals. Rokossovsky was able to save the corps commander, but Zhukov remained firm regarding the second officer. The general was immediately reduced in rank, sent to the front lines, and ordered to lead a suicidal attack. He was killed almost instantly. Zhukov thereupon recommended Russia's highest military award, Hero of the Soviet Union, for the fallen officer. Zhukov himself was a hero of the Soviet Union thrice over, as was his arch-competitor, Koniev. Honors had been heaped on both marshals, but while Zhukov's fame had spread throughout the USSR, Koniev remained virtually unknown, and the anonymity rankled. Koniev was a tall, gruff, vigorous man with a shrewd twinkle in his blue eyes. He was 48 years old, a year younger than Zhukov, and in some respects his career had paralleled the other man's. He too had fought for the Tsar, crossed over to the revolutionaries and continued to serve with the Soviet forces. But there was one difference, and to men like Zhukov it was a big one. Koniev had come into the Red Army as a political commissar, and although he switched to the command side in 1926 and became a regular officer, to other soldiers his background was forever tainted. Political officers had always been heartily disliked by the regular military. So powerful were they that a commander could not issue an order unless it was countersigned by the ranking commissar. Zhukov, though a loyal party man, had never regarded former commissars as true army professionals. It had been a constant irritant to him that in the pre-war years he and Koniev had commanded in the same theatres and had been promoted at about the same pace. Stalin, who had handpicked them both for his cadre of young generals in the 30s, was cannily aware of the intense rivalry between the men. He had made it a point to play one off against the other. Konev, despite his rough, outspoken manner, was generally regarded by the military as the more thoughtful and better educated of the two. A voracious reader, he kept a small library at his headquarters and occasionally surprised his staff by quoting passages from Turgenev and Pushkin. The rank and file of his armies knew him as a stern disciplinarian, but unlike Zhukov, he was considerate of his officers, reserving his wrath for the enemy. On the battlefield, he could be barbarous. During one phase of the Dnieper campaign, after his troops had surrounded several German divisions, Konev demanded their immediate surrender. When the Germans refused, he ordered his saber-wielding Cossacks to attack. "We let the Cossacks cut for as long as they wished," he told Milovan Djilas, head of the Yugoslav military mission to Moscow in 1944. "They even hacked off the hands of those who raised them to surrender." In this respect, at least, Zhukov and Konev saw eye to eye. They could not forgive Nazi atrocities. For Germans, they had neither mercy nor remorse. Now, as the two marshals walked along the second-floor corridor towards Stalin's suite of offices, both were reasonably certain that the matter to be discussed was Berlin. Tentative plans called for Zhukov's first Belorussia group of armies in the center to take the city. Marshal Rokossovsky's second Belarusian forces to the north and Konev's first Ukrainian army group on the south could be called in to help. But Zhukov was determined to take Berlin by himself. He had no intention of asking for assistance, especially not from Konev. Konev, however, had been giving Berlin a lot of thought himself. Zhukov's forces could be held up by terrain, especially in the heavily defended Selo Heights region lying just beyond the western banks of the Oder. If that happened, Konev thought he saw a chance to steal Zhukov's thunder. He even had a rough scheme of action in mind. Of course, everything would depend on Stalin, but this time Konev fervently hoped to beat out Zhukov and reap a long-awaited glory. If the opportunity presented itself, Konev thought that he just might race his rival for Berlin. Midway along the red-carpeted corridor, the escorting officers ushered Zhukov and Konev into a conference room. It was high-ceilinged, narrow, and almost filled by a long, massive, highly polished mahogany table surrounded by chairs. Two heavy chandeliers with clear, unfrosted bulbs blazed over the table. At an angle in one corner was a small desk and leather chair, and on the wall nearby hung a large picture of Lenin. The windows were draped, and there were no flags or insignia in the room. There were, however, chrome lithographs in identical dark frames of two of Russia's most famous military technicians. Catherine II's brilliant Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov and General Mikhail Kutuzov, who had destroyed Napoleon's armies in 1812. At one end of the room, double doors led to Stalin's private office. The marshals were not unfamiliar with the surroundings. Zhukov had worked down the hall when he was Chief of Staff in 1941, and both men had met here with Stalin many times before. But this conference was not to be a small private session. Within minutes after the two marshals entered the room, they were followed by the 7 most important men, after Stalin, in the wartime USSR, the members of the State Defense Committee, the all-powerful decision-making body of the Soviet war machine. Without formality or deference to rank, the Soviet leaders filed into the room. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav M. Molotov, the committee's deputy chairman, Lavrenti P. Beria, the thick-set myopic chief of the secret police and one of the most feared men in Russia, Georgy M. Malenkov, the rotund secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and military procurement administrator, Anastas Thursa-Mikoyan, thin-faced and hawk-nosed, the production coordinator, Marshal Nikolai A. Bulganin, the distinguished-looking goateed Supreme Headquarters representative to the Soviet fronts, stolid, mustachioed Lazar M. Kaganovich, transportation specialist and the lone Jew on the committee, and Nikolai A. Voznesensky, the economic planner and administrator. Representing the operational side of the military were the Chief of the General Staff, General A. Antonov, and the Operations Chief, General S. M. Shtemenko. As the top Soviet leaders took chairs, the doors to the Premier's office opened and the short, stocky figure of Stalin appeared. He was simply dressed in a mustard-coloured uniform, without epaulettes or rank insignia. His trousers, each seamed with a thin red stripe, were tucked into soft black knee-length boots. On the left side of his tunic he wore a single decoration, the red-ribboned gold star of a hero of the Soviet Union. Clamped in his teeth was one of his favourite pipes, a British Dunhill. He wasted little time in formalities. As Koniev was later to recall, "We barely managed to greet each other before Stalin began to talk." Stalin asked Zhukov and Koniev a few questions about conditions on the front. Then abruptly he got to the point. In his low voice, characterized by the peculiar sing-song accent of Georgia, he said quietly and with great effect, "The little Allies intend to get to Berlin ahead of the Red Army." He waited a moment before continuing. He had received information about Anglo-American plans, Stalin said, and it was clear that their intentions are less than Allied. He did not mention Eisenhower's message of the night before, nor did he give any other source for his information. Turning to General Shtemenko, he said, "Read the report." Shtemenko stood up. "Eisenhower's forces planned to surround and destroy the Ruhr concentrations of the enemy," he announced, then advanced to Leipzig and Dresden. "But just on the way, they intended to take Berlin. All of this," said the general, "will look like helping the Red Army." But it was known that taking Berlin before the arrival of Soviet troops was Eisenhower's main aim. Furthermore, he intoned, it had been learned by the Stavka that 2 Allied airborne divisions are being rapidly readied for a drop on Berlin. Koniev, in his version of the meeting, was later to remember that the Allied plan, as described by Shtemenko, also included a drive by Montgomery north of the Ruhr, along the shortest route separating Berlin from the basic groupings of the British forces. Shtemenko finished, Koniev recalled, by saying that, according to all the data and information, this plan, to take Berlin earlier than the Soviet army, is looked upon at the Anglo-American headquarters as fully realistic, and that preparation for its fulfillment is in full swing. As Shtemenko ended the military evaluation, Stalin turned to his 2 marshals. "So," he said softly, "who will take Berlin, we or the Allies?" Koniev later remembered proudly that he was the first to answer. "We will," he said, "and before the Anglo-Americans." Stalin looked at him, a slight smile flickering over his face. "So," he said again softly. With ponderous humour he added, "Is that the sort of fellow you are?" Then, in an instant, as Koniev remembers, Stalin was once more cold and businesslike, stabbing out questions. Exactly how was Koniev, on the south, prepared to capture Berlin in time? "Wouldn't a great regrouping of your forces be necessary?" he asked. Too late, Koniev saw the trap. Stalin was up to his old tricks again, pitting one man against the other, but by the time he realized this, Koniev had already begun to answer. "Comrade Stalin," he said, "all the measures needed will be carried out. We shall regroup in time to take Berlin." It was the moment Zhukov had waited for. "May I speak?" he asked quietly, almost condescendingly. He did not wait for an answer. "With due consideration," he said, nodding to Koniev, "the men of the First Belarusian Front need no regrouping. They are ready now. We are aimed directly at Berlin. We are the shortest distance from Berlin. We will take Berlin." Stalin looked at the 2 men in silence. Once again a smile showed briefly. "Very well," he said mildly. "You will both stay in Moscow and, with the General Staff, prepare your plans. I expect them ready within 48 hours. Then you can return to the front with everything approved." Both men were shocked by the brief time period allotted for the preparation of their plans. Up to now they had understood that the target date for attacking Berlin was early May. Now Stalin obviously expected them to attack weeks earlier. To Koniev, in particular, this was a sobering thought. Although he had a tentative plan which he believed would get him into Berlin before Zhukov, he had nothing on paper. The meeting now made him desperately aware of immense logistical problems that he must solve quickly. All kinds of equipment and supplies would now have to be rushed to the front. Worse, Koniev was short of troops. After the fighting in Upper Silesia, a considerable part of his forces was still spread out to the south. Some were miles from Berlin. These would have to be transferred immediately, posing a major transportation problem. Zhukov, listening to Stalin speak, was equally worried. Although his staff officers had been preparing for the attack, he was far from ready. His armies were in position, but he too was still bringing up supplies and rushing replacements to the front to fill out his badly depleted forces. Some of his divisions, usually 9,000 to 12,000 men strong, were down to 3,500. Zhukov believed the Berlin operations would be enormously difficult, and he wanted to be ready for every eventuality. His intelligence had reported that the city itself and its environs have been carefully prepared for stubborn defense. Each street, square, crossroad, house, canal and bridge is a component part of the overall defense. Now, everything would have to be speeded up if he was to beat the Western forces to Berlin. How soon could he attack? That was the question Stalin wanted answered, and quickly. As the meeting broke up, Stalin spoke once again. There was no warmth in his voice. To the two marshals he said with great emphasis, "I must tell you that the dates of the beginning of your operations will attract our special attention." The rivalry between the two commanders, never far beneath the surface, was being exploited once again. With a brief nod to the men around him, Stalin turned and left the room. Now, having set his plans in motion, the Soviet Premier still faced one important task: the careful detailing of an answer to Eisenhower's cable. Stalin began work on the prepared draft. By 8 p.m., his reply was finished and dispatched. "I have received your telegram of March 28, Stalin wired Eisenhower. Your plan to cut the German forces by joining with Soviet forces entirely coincides with the plan of the Soviet High Command." Stalin fully agreed that the link-up should be in the Leipzig-Dresden area, for the main blow of the Soviet forces would be made in that direction. The date of the Red Army's attack? Stalin gave that particular notice. It would be approximately the second half of May. The most important part of his message came in the third paragraph. There he implanted the impression that he had no interest in Germany's capital. "Berlin," he stated, "has lost its former strategic importance." In fact, Stalin said, it had become so unimportant that the Soviet High Command therefore plans to allot secondary forces in the direction of Berlin. Winston Churchill had conferred with the British Chiefs of Staff nearly all afternoon. He was feeling embarrassed and upset. His embarrassment stemmed from an Eisenhower message that had been garbled in transmission. One sentence in the cable Churchill received had read, "Montgomery will be responsible on patrol tasks." Sharply, Churchill had replied that he thought His Majesty's forces were being relegated to an unexpected restricted sphere. The bewildered Eisenhower had wired back, "I am disturbed, if not hurt. Nothing is further from my mind, and I think my record should eliminate any such idea." It turned out that Eisenhower had never used the words "on patrol tasks." He had said "on these tasks," and somehow the expression had been transmitted wrong. Churchill was chagrined by the incident which, trivial though it was, had compounded the mounting confusion. Far from trivial, in the Prime Minister's eyes, was the continuing American apathy toward Berlin. With the tenacity that had characterized him all his life, he now took on both problems, Allied relations and Berlin, at once. In a long telegram to the ailing Roosevelt, his first to FDR since the beginning of the SCAF 252 controversy, the Prime Minister first recorded at length his complete confidence in Eisenhower. Then, having disposed of these misunderstandings between the truest friends and allies that have ever fought side by side, Churchill hammered away at the urgency of taking the German capital. "Nothing will exert a psychological effect of despair upon German forces, equal to that of the fall of Berlin," he argued. "It will be the supreme signal of defeat. If the Russians take Berlin, will not their impression that they have been the overwhelming contributor to the common victory be unduly imprinted in their minds? And may this not lead them into a mood which will raise grave and formidable difficulties in the future? I therefore consider that from a political standpoint, should Berlin be in our grasp, we should certainly take it.